Good morning, East Bay. What is happening in Alameda, Contra Costa, and Solano counties? Learn about what's happening in our communities, an in-depth conversation so you know what's going on. We're talking to government, economic, political, nonprofit, and business leaders here in the greater East Bay. I'm Jared Asch, the host of the Capstone Conversation. Today, we are joined by Chris Rico, who is the president and CEO of Solano Economic Development Corporation. Welcome, Chris.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to the Solano EDC.
It's a very circuitous path, but it's something that when I reached a point where I got to synthesize all the other things that I'd done in my life, it finally made sense, much to the delight of my mom, who throughout my entire career just periodically would say, "Do you have a plan?" Because I went to Duke to study international relations and I studied in Geneva at the United Nations. And then I started promoting rock bands my senior year in college. And then I ended up working in Hollywood for a decade. When I graduated from Duke in 93, the global economy wasn't very good. I was, came from a single mom, not well connected, closeted gay man. So going into the foreign service was not something that was really tenable for me. And I had a bunch of friends. I went to high school in Manhattan Beach in Southern California. So I had a bunch of friends in LA who ended up working in the entertainment industry. And that's just where I found myself. I spent a decade kind of toiling as an assistant at like talent agencies and studios, and eventually was chief of staff to the president of one of the studios. Finally, when I made it to the executive ranks, when I was like, I don't know, in my early 30s, I looked around and I was like, oh, I don't like these people. Like I've had this goal to succeed here, and I just not really want to be, because what I discovered at that point is that I'm very purpose driven.
Are you talking about politicians or talent?
Yeah, I'm talking about people in Hollywood, right? Well, because here, hold on to that, because one of the things that I did in my 30s was work on political campaigns. So started with going to be a diplomat, worked in entertainment for a decade, but then what I did immediately after that was I went to teach students with special needs at Johnny Cochran Middle School in South LA, and it's like a 180-degree pivot. I really and still believe this to the day, like education is the key to everything, right? Like if you want to look at all of our problems, it sort of goes back to look at where we are right now in terms of literacy, where we are in terms of how we test versus other industrialized countries in the world. We're really sort of bottom of the barrel or low middle in most of those metrics. And I think we're seeing what happens when you have a poorly educated society borne out with what's happening in this country today. So I needed to go in and see for myself what it was going on the front lines. And, my joke about learning to teach students with special needs was, had I done that before I worked in Hollywood, I would have been more successful. I would say that also about working in politics. I ran some progressive political campaigns. I worked for MoveOn.org at one point. I worked on Ariana Huffington's gubernatorial campaign, which was really fascinating, where I got to work alongside Van Jones, who was leading that campaign. They recruited Ariana. I don't know if you remember, it was the recall election. So met a really cool kind of ecosystem of people there who are on that kind of progressive left. And then eventually, my plan when I decided to go teach was that I was going to marry an earner. I was like, I'm going to be the do-gooder and not make a lot of money. I'll raise the kids. I'll be the PTA president. And then I turned 40 and I was like, oh, I have to be the earner. How's that going to happen? And at that point, I had been an executive in different realms, but I didn't have 15 years experience of doing a thing. And when you go to interview for those director level, VP level jobs, and you look at what they want from you, it's, we want you to have 15 to 20 years experience doing this. So I was never getting those jobs. And so I actually hired a graphic designer and I designed my own resume, which was highly scaffolded with like a color coded key. And it really showed, here's the 3 disciplines where I have mastery: entertainment, education, and politics. And here's sort of quiver of arrows that I have now because of that, and that I have relationships across all of these. That landed on the desk of the COO of the Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation, the LAEDC, when they were looking for a new director of innovation, and he hired me. I suddenly became the director of innovation for Los Angeles, which was this really stupid title, because the idea that I could direct innovation as a department of one, for the 15th largest economy on the planet was sort of silly. But what I did was I approached it as a marketing exercise and I said, okay, how can I help lift up this innovation ecosystem in Los Angeles? What if we told the story? What if we told people that the Bay Area may have tech, but if you want to innovate anything, come to LA. At that point, we had 3 different Hyperloop companies. SpaceX was launching rockets on a Tuesday. Obviously, you had Hollywood and then all this sort of digitization that was coming out of that, and marketing and media and biotech and art and fashion and food. So it was really fun to build out a 3-week festival. Ultimately, it became with 180 events called Innovate LA. And that was my real legacy from that job. And I was not supported at all, so I had to learn to do everything. I had to learn how to do the marketing, I had to do the fundraising. No one ever wants to be in development, right? No one wants to beg for money. It's like not the fun thing to do, but now I run an organization where I'm responsible for raising money. Thank God I have that experience, and I don't mind going to large corporations and asking them for money, especially when it's to do great things, right? Because that's the gift of this job that I get to wake up and do every day is that as an organization, our life is to help make our jobs is to try to help make other people's lives better, right? That's what the goal of it is, right? Bring more prosperity to businesses and people. I'm never Sunday night bummed that I have to go to work on Monday. And that's a really nice feeling to have because it means you actually get to enjoy your Sunday. Because previously, like 11 a.m. Sunday, I'm thinking about Monday. So, right.
Yeah.
So long story, but that's how I made my way here.
Yeah, it's good to get to know you now. So talk about what is the mission of the EDC, and then we'll get into your current big initiative.
When I inherited this role, my predecessor with board direction was tasked with attracting businesses to Solano County. And so he went to a lot of trade shows and took out ads in magazines and ran digital marketing campaigns. But then it was also the pandemic. So, not a lot was happening in general. But I came in and said, listen, I have a different hypothesis, which is you actually have to do things and then you go tell your story. And what are we doing here? Like, what's the story that we're going to tell to businesses that we want to attract here? And then in speaking to the large employers in the region, most of whom are on my board, their number one concern was housing and that they have a difficult time attracting young talent, which that goes to placemaking, right? Like, how are we designing our cities? And that's one of the things I know, Jared, you were at the Benicia State of the City, but I spoke about that too. Like, you have to design for the young people that you want to attract because as we age, and the largest cohort in Solano County is 65 plus, someone has to pay for those things that people need, right? So it's kind of like how our economy is built and Social Security, all those things, right? It's why we actually need immigration. You need that bottom of the pyramid to keep paying in so the rest of us can benefit from it. That's why we started focusing on things like bringing more multifamily housing to Solano County. We have 14%. The state average is 25. And that's directly at the request of the large corporations. One of the strategies that we have is to proliferate accessory dwelling units. It's an inherently affordable unit of housing. It solves a lot of problems for people who have, say, a 30-year-old has a master's degree in antiquities and $200,000 worth of debt and is now living in your sewing room. Where are you going to put them, right? Or I would say probably, I don't know. I don't have data, but if I were to guess, I would say a quarter of those people 65 plus probably shouldn't be living in the houses that they're living in. They're not safe. They're multi-story. It's bigger than they need, right? But where are they going to go? If you've spent your entire life in Fairfield, you built your business there, your kids went to school there, you were part of the Seroptimus or the Rotary, and your whole life is there, you want to stay there, right? But we're not building for seniors either. I mean, if you look around California where 55 plus communities are, and listen, granted, we have some of those in Rio Vista, but if you live in Solano County, Rio Vista doesn't necessarily feel like the middle of nowhere, but relative to, if you live in the kind of coastal geographies, it's kind of an outlying place like Tehachapi or Visalia, which are like the other places where you drive through and they have 55 plus communities. It's like we put people out to pasture and there's no services there. So that makes no sense, right? So ADUs can help people age in place. They can build an ADU, give their house to the kids, which is one of the complaints we hear from people in Solano County is that their kids can no longer afford to live here. And that's pretty consistent if you start at the coast and work your way inland. everyone's kids are having to move either to Sacramento, and now that's expensive, or they're going to Arizona or whatever because they can't afford to live where they grew up. And that's the case with my sister's family. Like, she raised her kids in Poway, and they've now moved to Arizona.
There's a couple points on there. I'm going to come back to multifamily apartments, even senior housing and young professional. That all comes out of the Moving Solano Forward 3 initiative that you are working on.
Yeah,
And I know you've been going around the whole county and talking a lot about it.
right.
So give an overview and then let's dive into some next steps on details instead of diving. Like, I don't want to spend 30 minutes going through the report.
Yeah, no
Give
one does. Thankfully, we were able to create some real strategies that we can operationalize. I mean, the biggest takeaways from that report is a 450-page, pretty exhaustive study from Newmark Global Consulting. It was funded by the EDA, the Economic Development Administration, and it was already in process when I took over this organization. Biggest takeaway is that we need to focus on bringing more advanced manufacturing to Solano County, right? And that we're losing young people, and that our current employers have a hard time attracting that young talent to Solano County. I would say the biggest point of emphasis coming out of that is, coincidentally, while that was in process, we already went out and sought grant funding from MTC ABAG. And for your listeners, that's Metropolitan Transportation Commission, Association of Bay Area Governments. They used to be two separate things. At some point, MTC subsumed ABAG. And ABAG is like our cog, right? So in any region, there's like a council of governments that works collaboratively. A lot of times it organizes around transit because that's the place where you don't have a choice. You have to collaborate with your neighboring county because roads connect and bridges connect, right? There's a lot of money that flows through transit. Bigger context, there's a plan called Plan Bay Area 2050. And one of the key tenets of that plan in the 9 Bay Area counties is to try to align jobs with housing. And places like Solano and Eastern Contra Costa are the two places where they have the best opportunity to do that, because you have relatively affordable housing, and most of the people commute out of those counties to go make money somewhere else. So we have 140,000 people who commute out of Solano County every day to go to work. And then you can imagine what are all the downstream effects. And there are huge consequences to that. First of all, people spend their lives in their car and they're in traffic. There's pollution, right? Quality of life issues. Families aren't there to go to their kids' soccer game, right? So I think the pandemic really showed people what it was like to not have to spend their life in the car when they got to work from home. I think there's a real appetite to figure that out. We need to bring those good jobs to Solano County, and that's what we're really focused on. And in fact, I'm working now to pull together a consortium of leaders to work on creating a specific advanced manufacturing strategy for Solano County. And that's the key, right? We have to go on offense. I don't know well, I'll share a little bit. So how it currently works is industrial developers will decide that they want to build something in Solano County, say, Dermody. And they'll go to PG and say, hey, we're going to build these 5 logistics buildings in Fairfield, and here's our power requirements. But they only submit power requirements for logistics buildings. But we want advanced manufacturing. So these buildings go up and there isn't enough power for a factory. And real world example, Upside Foods, $400 million venture-backed lab-grown animal protein company, wanted to go to Fairfield. And they chose to go to Illinois because it was going to take 3 years to get power. So that's why we need to actually have a plan, and we need to actually go on offense and say, no, this is what we want here. And these are the infrastructure needs of this kind of application. Because otherwise, based on where we are geographically, we're just going to keep getting logistics. And that's a recipe to us going broke.
I want to hit on a couple points you said, because I did some quick math, and how many people do you say commute out of the county? And this is
140,000.
That is more than probably about 3/4 of the people between 18 and 65 in the county. Like, I want to paint that picture. We're talking 3/4
Yep.
of people 18 to 65 are leaving the county post-COVID on a daily basis.
Yeah. And listen, maybe now they're not doing it 5 days a week, right? Maybe some people have the luxury of, but still, I mean, and someone brought this up. I don't know, in some form recently. Like, have you driven? It doesn't seem like there's less traffic when you're out on any of these roads, right? Somebody's going somewhere. So there's still, soul crushing traffic for a lot of people, and it doesn't need to be that way.
Yeah. So the power issue, when I interviewed Don Burris, who was the economic development director for the city of Vacaville, he talked about that being their biggest problem. They are attracting a lot of life science companies there, and they have a whole innovation park, and they
Yeah.
don't know that they're ever going to have power
I was just
around that.
I
How
was
do you
just with
address
Don
that?
recently, and Don is one of the people that will be instrumental in building this advanced manufacturing strategy. He's the one who led the charge of building out that life science biomanufacturing strategy in Vacaville. So, and I was just with him recently talking to the head of the CMTA, which is the Manufacturing Trade Association in California. And we were power always comes up, right? And Don had shared with me that in Hayward, Rivian wanted to expand. And their internal consultant said, okay, you should lease these buildings. We can get you power in 9 months. They signed the lease, and then PG&E came back and said it was going to be 9 years. How can anybody do business that way, right? Like, why would you come to California when you could go to Nevada where the power is half the price, or SMUD for that matter, around Sacramento? Power's cheaper there. So we can't compete with that. And it's a huge problem. It's existential for us, frankly. If we actually had an abundance of power, we'd be killing it on the business attraction front right now because everyone's looking for power. As it turns out, advanced manufacturing takes a lot of power.
Yeah. And by the way, that's a problem in parts of Texas too, where companies are moving there and the utilities are saying, nobody checked with us first.
Right.
Thanks.
Yeah. I listen, and by the way, and I have spoken about this. This is not a California problem. This is a national problem. Almost all of these states have these legacy utilities from the last century that were built on a certain model, and they don't keep up with the needs of today, where how things need to be more nimble, which is why, thankfully, one of the other things that we're exploring when we do the priority production lands, we have that grant from MTCA bag for our priority production lands, which is the industrial land. Our real emphasis is on power. And how do we establish these spaces in a way that they have built in abundant, clean, renewable power? Because then it's going to be really easy for us to go find the companies that we want. So I know we'll probably touch on California forever at some point. It's certainly topical and certainly monopolizes a lot of my time lately. But one of the things that I would say I would be excited about if they do actually win in November, and you know, who knows how likely that is the fact that we could leverage that as a way to explore different power options for Solano County through microgrids, right? Through just new technology that they have access to, that their investors have access to. Like that to me is exciting. And it's something, frankly, that Travis Air Force Base needs. They have one source of power. They need redundancy. So as much as people, I think, want to paint it as a very black and white situation, I think there's a lot of pros and cons, but there's some things I think to be excited about too.
That's a national security issue for Travis, as well as other military bases. I think it came out about a year ago that Fort Bragg had lost, which is a crucial base, lost power for like 3 days at like two different increments because there wasn't enough power on the grid.
I will share that, Sandy Person, who runs the Travis Community Consortium, is my colleague, and that organization is domiciled within our organization. And she and other leaders, including David Gassaway, the city manager of Fairfield, went out and got a $1.2 million grant. It's a MER grant, so it's Military Installation Resiliency something, I think. And it comes from Old CC, which is the Office of Legacy Defense something. That's all I got. So anyway, but specifically to look at what are the infrastructure needs adjacent to this massive military installation that we all need to be cognizant of, because at the end of the day, it's a $2.7 billion driver of our regional economy. If you look at what happened to Vallejo after Mare Island closed, you can only imagine what would happen to Solano County if we lost Travis Air Force Base, which is why, in the conversation around could California Forever's vision be viable, I understand why, John Gary Mendy, who sits on the Defense Appropriations Commission and is in the House, is so staunchly opposed to this. Like, I get people's concerns around Travis. Like, that's legitimate. I don't think the concerns are insurmountable. And I have, have and will continue to say, like, that's the hill I'll die on with regards to this, is anything that compromises Travis.
And I don't think anybody on either side everybody seems to be in agreement, I should say, on that, is that everybody in the county realizes how important Travis is and wants it to continue there. I want to talk about the young professional
Yeah.
aspect. How do you recruit young professionals? How do you keep them in the county? What That's great in theory.
Yeah.
What's going to attract them?
But let me give you an example of something that we're working on. So another grant that we got from MTCA bag was for our priority development areas, and that's for housing. And we got the city of Sassoon, the city of Fairfield, STA, which is the Solano Transit Agency, whose offices are in Sassoon City, and the county to all co-apply with us for this $400,000 grant. And what we want to explore is, how do we build dense transit-oriented housing around the Fairfield Sassoon train station, which is a very underutilized asset? I'm one of the few people who actually takes that train. I say one of the few people because every time I go there, one or two other people maybe get on the train when I get on the train. And that parking lot is generally pretty empty around there. A lot of that has to do with the fact that it's not safe. There's a freeway that runs through there, the 12, and there's a massive unhoused population that lives underneath of it. And the consequence is that downtown Fairfield and downtown Sassoon grossly underperform based on what they could. And so what I want to imagine is, what if there's thousands of units of housing for young professionals by this train station? We know that not everyone needs to go into the city 5 days a week anymore. Say you only have to go 1 or 2 days a week. And you could have this more bucolic life where you walk out your front door of your cool, new, hip apartment that has a gym and, all this other stuff. And you could say, hey, do I want to go to my right and go to downtown Fairfield, which has this like small town American charm? Or do I want to go to this cool fishing village right here? And where else could you walk out your front door and choose two downtowns that are walkable from you? So that's the kind of thinking that we need to have to attract young professionals.
And that makes sense in terms of building the housing and everything else. There needs to be a vibrancy.
For
And
sure.
in Sassoon, cute fishing village, feels safe to walk on that side of it through the little downtown, but there's not a lot
Nothing
there.
happening. No,
Same thing in downtown Fairfield. If
for
somebody
sure.
a coffee shop, there's not enough
Right. So
traffic.
again, it's a complex equation. But there is a little, if you build it, they will come. If suddenly you had a dense concentration of young professionals that were coming on, if those apartments were coming online and you're Starbucks or you're whoever, and you're looking at, okay, suddenly putting a Starbucks in downtown Fairfield or downtown Sassoon is going to make sense, right? Like, it's those catalysts. And I would say the same for downtown Vallejo. Downtown Vallejo has the best bones. That place could be amazing. I mean, even as challenged as Vallejo is, and I live in Vallejo, you still walk around that downtown, you're like, the buildings are pretty, right? They're interesting, they're architectural, they're significant. What they don't have is a cluster of young professionals who live close to that downtown. The only housing developments that are adjacent to that downtown are more like low-income housing. They've done a really good job of cleaning them up. They don't feel as unsafe as they did before. And I think that it's perfectly appropriate to have those in the mix, but it can't be the only thing, because the consequence is it's a little bit of a ghost town. And the people who do take the ferry, and ferry ridership is way down because that parking lot isn't particularly safe. There's a lot of break-ins, right? Because there's a lot of unhoused people down there. Imagine if there were 300 market rate condos on the waterfront in Vallejo where you could walk out your door and I have to tell you, if people haven't taken the ferry to San Francisco, that's one of the best experiences in the Bay Area, particularly if you're working. They have Wi-Fi, they have coffee, and they have drinks in the afternoon. I will speak for myself, but I know this is the same for a lot of people. We always have unanswered emails that we don't want to answer. And you keep saying that you're going to do it at the end of the day, and the end of the day comes and you're like, I'll do it tomorrow, because you don't want to do it. Well, guess what? If you're on a ferry that has Wi-Fi and you have a drink or some coffee, like, you make that into productive time. And I think that's such a brilliant way to navigate life and work. And I think that we could attract young professional people, particularly diverse young professionals who realize that Vallejo is the most diverse city in the country. I think there's so much opportunity. It's really just about making those strategic choices that can be catalysts, and then placemaking. And listen, Fairfield's already doing a downtown specific plan. They've already started doing traffic calming. They have bike lanes. They're taking down these sort of antiquated arches and columns that were from the 80s. Like they're zhuzhing it up, right? The other thing that you can do is work to attract artists. It's like the number one go-to playbook if you want to transform an area is attract artists. Look at the Arts District in Los Angeles. It was derelict warehouses, the artists moved in, and then of course invariably they priced themselves out, but they perform this necessary function in the ecosystem. It's something that frankly gays and lesbians used to do more of before they had kids. They would go into places where the school districts were bad because they wanted to buy really cool old homes and they would fix them up. I lived in Columbus, Ohio for a year, and it's also where I was born. And if you've ever been to Columbus, when white flight happened and people started going out of the urban cores, all of these neighborhoods surrounding downtown Columbus fell into disrepair, and they were Victorian village, German village, Italian village. And the city at one point decided to sell those rundown houses for $1, but you had to sign a commitment to spend a certain amount of money. And the community that did most of that was gay men who were like, yes, I will buy this Victorian home for $1. These houses are worth like several $1,000,000 now. And I talked to a realtor once. She's like, yeah, I made my career of just following gay people around. Wherever they went, I knew that that was the place to go. So it's making choices like that. And listen, Vallejo could use more of that. So I am a gay man without kids. So I've been my friends to move here, the ones who don't have kids.
And who owns the waterfront area in Vallejo? Is that that you're talking about?
The
Is that
city owns a lot of it, and I think those 2 parking lots they're open to those kinds of deals because obviously they understand that it impacts ridership. So imagine if those 2 large parking lots were, you know, 4-story buildings with market rate condos, and then you can put the parking there as well. And then all of a sudden you have this catalyst for people who are going to shop downtown. And the thing that's great about that particular location is Wilson Road along, or whatever it's called in that stretch along the waterfront there, was supposed to be a freeway. So if you ever go to the city hall building, none of the windows face the water because it was supposed to be a freeway. So you're not blocking anybody. You could put those up and you're not blocking anybody's view. And, it's the thing that I try to reinforce all the time with folks here is like, that's the money shot, right? That's where we have the best opportunity to monetize is on that waterfront. And yes, we can build affordable housing as well, but we also need people with money who can shop here too. Like we can't just build affordable housing.
we'll have Seamus on this summer talking about the ferry system and how I think he's got a good ear for economic development and how that needs to be part of the future of the ferry system.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the Green Empowerment Zone in Solano and what is that and where's that going?
I think after a year finally getting everything together in terms of bylaws and who's on the board, its primary focus is on Contra Costa along the waterfront, and it's really about the just transition from the carbon economy. But because we have the Valero refinery in Benicia and Vallejo are part of it, and they just voted to actually add Richmond into it as well, which I think is in Alameda County, right?
That's also in Contra Costa
Oh, it is
County.
also in Contra Costa. I don't know why they had to vote to add Richmond in. I still am unclear, but what I will tell you, it's encouraging and it's also frustrating, is that the Green Empowerment Zone exists, but there's also a Green Jobs Collaborative, and then there's also a High Road Training Collaborative, and then there's also what used to be called SURF, which was the Community Economic Resiliency Fund that came out of ARPA funding that was in the state general fund, and now that's called California Jobs First, and they're all like, if you were to make a Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap between these things, but no one is architecting from above to make sure that these things aren't being redundant, that they're actually collaborating with each other. So I go to these meetings for these different things and I'm like, wait, have you talked to these other people? Because they just hired the Berkeley Labor Center to do labor studies. Do you need to hire the Berkeley Labor Center to do labor? Can you use theirs? It's that where it's like, yeah. So it's encouraging in the sense that these things are starting to happen. But before we started recording, we were talking about at some points you wish you were, Indonesia, where you could just say, "Hey, we're doing this." There is a time where it's like, oh, if it was an autocratic society where we could just say, "Hey, we're doing this." We don't have to go through 10 years of committees and negotiating and all this other stuff. Because by the way, if you follow, where the investment's going into Build Back Better, it's not coming here. It's going to Georgia and other places.
That careful, because the autocratic rule is one of the forefronts of the presidential campaign, whether
No, I
citing
know, I know, I know. Listen, I say that in jest. I say that in jest.
and if you guys want, if people want more about the Green Empowerment Zone, Supervisor John Joya of Contra Costa, who's I think the chair in that committee,
That's right.
talked a lot about it in his podcast, which appeared in January. So we can't talk about Solano County and not talk about California Forever, especially while people in Solano may be a little bit tired of it. We have listeners in Alameda and Contra Costa as well. California Forever is the cutesy name for the billionaire backed new city in Solano County. For those of you who aren't following it, and we're going to have Jan Sramick, the CEO of that effort, come on in the fall before it goes to vote. There's about 60,000 acres in Solano County that is owned by this, and it's protected by the Orderly Growth Initiative. And so to change that Orderly Growth Initiative line before they can go to building permits, it has to go to a vote countywide in the county. I don't want to talk about all the politics of it. I want to talk to the economic development guy, the CEO who runs the economic development agency. What is the economic impact of somebody owning 60,000 acres that is non-development? We talked about power a little bit. We talked about it and how it could help with that, but let's get some broad take. I'm not asking if you're in favor of it, if you're against it. Let's talk about economic development.
Yeah. Well, I mean, listen, this is so loaded. We could talk for hours about it. I mean, I like to look at the pros and the cons and the big unknown. And I think the thing that people rightfully are scared of is that there's the potential for a lot of unintended consequences to this. And, I think Mountain House is probably the best cautionary tale that's local that should resonate with people. They initially said they were going to build 45,000 homes and have 21,000 jobs. Same thing. They're like, we're going to bring those Silicon Valley companies out here so that the people who are currently commuting there can just work close to home. And then 2008 happened. And then what they ended up doing was 30,000 homes with 1,200 low-paying jobs. So they created just a worse situation because that's thousands and thousands of more people that are commuting to the South Bay from the middle of nowhere. And that's, I think, legitimately the biggest concern for what could happen with California Forever. That's legitimate. I also think, my point earlier about people sitting in soul-crushing traffic, I mean, California Forever, they talk about it being up to 400,000 people someday. I think that's probably, how many phases in, if you look at like what the Irvine company has done in Orange County, it's taken place over decades and decades and decades, right? And it's grown and grown and grown, but it happened incrementally in phases. And what would that impact be if they don't actually successfully create the job? So to me, the most exciting thing about it is, and I want to go back to the thing that everybody's referring to this as billionaires. First of all, I don't think they're all billionaires, but some of them are. But I just want to point out who builds big things, right? Like we can all criticize billionaires and there's a lot to criticize them about, and they definitely don't pay their fair share of taxes. But there's a big project on the waterfront in San Francisco that's being built by Meg Whitman's family office. There has not been one article about the fact that Meg Whitman, a billionaire, is built. I think that is so, who cares, right? Like, yes, people with money invested in something. I think you got to look at it on its merits. I get why people don't trust them. Obviously, there's this taint about how they acquired the land. Tell me anybody who's ever acquired land before that didn't have to be quiet about what they were doing. Disney created 1,000 shell companies in Florida so that no one knew who was buying the land. To their credit, and maybe, they regret this, everybody knew that Flannery, this mysterious Flannery, was buying up land. So they ended up paying 4 times as much for that land as they would have otherwise. And that, by the way, created a lot of rich people in Solano County, and it created tax revenue for the county. And if California Forever is successful at building what they want, it's going to create a lot of other tax revenue for the county. So you can choose whether you are in favor of that or not. But I think I just want to look at this objectively and have conversations about the pros and cons. I think the transportation and the infrastructure are probably the things that are most challenging for this and potentially insurmountable, right? Like, how are you planning on getting this many people here? Where are they going? If we talked about Fairfield and Sassoon, downtown Fairfield and downtown Sassoon suffer because there's a freeway that runs between them. That is literally in Sassoon's case, it's almost on the waterfront. And in Fairfield's case, it's 3 blocks from their downtown core. That's a real challenge. Unless you're like Chicago, you can't really get away with freeways in the middle of the city, right? Like, or the L train or whatever going by. So yeah, there's no version of expanding the 12 that it's going to work out well for downtown Fairfield and downtown Sassoon. And Travis doesn't want that either because that's more cars going at their, Peterson gate, which they don't want.
Yeah, all legit concerns. And I was in a conversation recently in Benicia where he spoke at the Chamber of Commerce luncheon there. And somebody was saying, related to the promises that California Forever has made, particularly around job creation, that's a big part of it, but that can't be, and there's legal reasons why that's not part of the ballot initiative and everything else. From your standpoint, and maybe from the county government standpoint, how does they get held accountable that the job creation numbers and dollar figures happen in the way they're talking about, which is to what you said, didn't happen in Mountain Home? How did somebody like you hold them
Yeah.
accountable and pay attention to work with them?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I talked to them about this a lot, and that provision around, creating a certain amount of jobs, that only kicks in once they've built housing for 50,000 people, right? So really, you're not on the hook for one job until 50,000 people are there. I would have encouraged them to change that. The reality is, if this all happens at the same time that the Mare Island Company starts building, IRG is in talks to redevelop the county property, the county fairground property next to Six Flags, and then they're gonna build this, everyone's gonna need construction employees. Like, they're going to have to create jobs. They don't have a choice. The other thing is, and this is the thing that I try to reinforce with them all the time, as much as I didn't like math, I always think about the order of operations when I'm looking at things like this. And for them, to me, if they actually focus on the jobs first, it really unlocks the housing. Help us. We're already in process of building out our industrial areas. Use your relationships to these billionaires, to these tech companies to get the kind of jobs here that we want. By the way, we already have the Bay Area COG who has a strategy around this. We want to do it, right? There's a lot of things that are already aligned in your favor. We have infrastructure money coming. We have the Build Back Better. Tap into this. Work with us. Get these jobs here first. Then you don't have 140,000 people are commuting. Then you need that housing, and people are less concerned about clogging up the roads, right? Because you freed up some of that space, and that new industry gives you resources to build the infrastructure that you need to do something like they want to do in the first place. I think the thing that's built in is it's the only way that they can do it. That's my opinion.
That's helpful. I also want to bring back, we touched briefly on life sciences and biotech, particularly that's being built in Vacaville. How does your organization work with the city of Vacaville? We talked about the power side, so I'm going to leave that. How do you guys continue to recruit life science companies in there and talk about the infrastructure behind that? Because it's not just going to a life science company and saying, hey, we're here.
Right. I mean, the best thing that they did, and Don probably talked about this, was they created that bachelor's program at Solano Community College. It's the number one thing that was a catalyst to that was the talent. So as we build out our advanced manufacturing strategy, we're already in conversations with the Workforce Development Board and the community college, and labor, which has their CTWI, their career technical, I always forget what these initials are for. And workforce initiative, career technical workforce initiative, which is really the vehicle that they've been tasked with bringing more diversity into construction trades. They've been really successful in getting project labor agreements all over. But when they started getting them in places like Berkeley and other kind of liberal bastions, they started saying, hey, but by the way, how many Black people are working in construction? And the reality is that it's not a lot. So they created CTWI as a means to start bringing more diversity in. I'm already working with them, and I'm already talking to Jan and his team about, look, even before you figure out whether you guys win in November, let's start working on this stuff because it has to happen regardless. We need to develop this talent that's underutilized, and there's a lot of it in Vallejo. So once we actually start getting those programs in place, then we have that talent pipeline that's ready to go. And that's where you can start going out and competing. And that's the key. And that's something that we can be impactful in.
And we have James, I hope that's how you say his last name, who created that 4-year program in Solano Community College. He's doing a podcast episode as well this spring, talking about that and how the college worked with businesses to innovate and deliver the best employees, whether it's in the Vacaville area or it's in South San Francisco, where there's a cluster of life science companies as well.
Yeah, that's the key. And we live at the nexus of the public and the private, right? So we're the place to build those relationships. And I will say, when you do talk to Jim DeClos, be sure to bring up California Forever, because he has very strong feelings about that.
Oh, we will do that. Chris, and before we head out, any other initiatives or any other thoughts you want to leave everybody with?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I want to share that I'm really proud about is that we put on a nonprofit capacity building summit on Mare Island in November, with a lot of support from the county, but also from the Kaiser Foundation, the Sutter Foundation, from Travis Credit Union, from Toro, from First Five, Bay Area Ferry, Thistle. We had a lot of amazing sponsors, and Wells Fargo Foundation is actually funding a cohort of nonprofit leaders who are now going through a whole year of capacity building support. One of the things that I've been trying to emphasize, and I have to defend myself around this because people ask, okay, why is supporting nonprofits economic development? And I was like, why do I have to explain why equipping these organizations that get in and work amongst the least of us, right? The folks who need education, that need job training, that need housing, we need them to be resourced because we don't have money to do those things, right? And if we do, wouldn't it be better if we spent it on something else, right? So I'd rather take people who are currently on some kind of government assistance and train them and get them a job so that they actually become taxpayers. Like, that's the goal. Utilize the talent that we have. So proud of that work, and we'll continue to fundraise, because the sad reality is we receive $1 of philanthropy for we receive a penny of philanthropy for every $1 that San Francisco receives. And based on demographics, we have more need than any other county in the Bay Area. So we have the most need and we get a fraction of the philanthropy.
That's a big number. I've seen that chart going around, how little per 100,000 people Solano gets in proportion on the dollar than the other counties.
And a lot of that goes back to storytelling. Like, we need to go out and tell our story. And that's something that I've been really focused on as well. And that's one of the things that will help us when we really lock in on the attracting new companies is, here's all the things we're doing, and here's the story that we're going to tell that's going to make you excited about being here.
Great. I appreciate it. Chris Rico, President and CEO of Solano EDC. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, happy to help.
Wait, don't leave yet. Hit subscribe. Make sure you get the weekly updates. We have a new episode every Wednesday for stuff happening in the East Bay. In the meantime, follow me on LinkedIn, Jared Asch, or check out our firm where we have a weekly newsletter and blog at Capstone Government Affairs on LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us today on the Capstone Conversation.